Adaptations. The easiest job in screenwriting, right? Already got the source material, just copy and paste the important stuff into script form and then go to lunch. That's it, right?
Super easy, barely an inconvenience.
Oh, really? Wrong. See, adapting existing stories into movies is more tricky than you might think. Different mediums have different strengths and weaknesses, and details that work on the page might not translate so well to the screen.
My name's the human spider.
I don't care, get out there.
No, he got my name wrong.
Get
you
out
gotta tell
there,
him.
you moron.
And that's before we even get to fan expectations. In this video, we're going to be looking at some movie adaptations that made big changes. Sometimes for the better, sometimes, maybe not so much. While the Marvel Cinematic Universe has mostly managed to please both general audiences and comics fans, it's fair to say that the movies have taken some pretty major liberties with their source material. The filmmakers will often take the basic idea and characters from a particular run, or sometimes just the title, but then build a very different story on top of it.
Best of both worlds.
It's a good way of keeping things accessible, even if that means that the final result might not look much like the comic it's based on. And that's exactly what they did with the character of Thanos in Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame.
Thanos is coming, it doesn't matter who you're talking to or not.
See, in the comics, the Mad Titan wants to murder billions with the Infinity Stones so that he can impress Mistress Death. It's an act of pure nihilism, and while it's appropriately poetic and cosmic for the comics, it might have been a little bit too out there for regular cinema goers. After all, Infinity War was already a big movie stuffed with characters. Introducing the literal manifestation of the concept of death, that thing would have been about a Zack Snyder cut long. Honestly though, we all would have watched that thing regardless.
Right?
So, quick memo to Peter Jackson, you do know that the Eye of Sauron was meant to be a metaphor, right? Not like a literal, actual eye? Anyway, we do love Mr. Jackson and his work, but plenty of Lord of the Rings fans were kind of annoyed with Jackson's decision to make this change when adapting the trilogy, giving Sauron a huge eye on top of a tower. And yes, it is an extremely literal interpretation, but Tolkien meant the eye to symbolize Sauron's far-reaching evil influence. That being said, we can cut him some slack because film is a visual medium, and you can't deny that it makes for a pretty effective visual, especially as Sauron doesn't exactly have a body in the movies. Though again, that's something that Jackson changed when adapting the books. Overall, we'd say it's an effective change, and with apologies to his fans, we'd say ultimately Jackson was right not to include Tom Bombadil. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 are rightfully held up as classics of the superhero movie genre. The third one, yeah, not so much, and there are plenty of reasons for that, but the one that rightly irritated fans was the decision to retcon the death of Uncle Ben in order to make the Sandman responsible. That's not how it went down in the comics, and it's not even how it went down in the first Spider-Man movie. It was, frankly, an unnecessary change that complicated an already overcomplicated sequel.
Continue.
I mean, did we really need an extra revenge plot on top of the symbiote, evil Spider-Man, new Green Goblin, and Sandman? Yeah, no. Most importantly, it robbed Uncle Ben's iconic death of some of its resonance, and that's just unforgivable. Where do we even begin with the Hobbit trilogy? It's kinda hard to pinpoint one specific change that Mr. Jackson and his team made when adapting the book for the screen, so let's take a look at it more broadly. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit is a slim, lighthearted adventure for children with a pretty linear plot. The film trilogy is decidedly not that. And while it may have made sound business sense to connect the movies to the phenomenally popular Lord of the Rings trilogy, the end result just felt kinda messy and bloated. Continuity shenanigans, huge battles, Gandalf side quests, extra details from the synopses of other books. Worst of all, the titular Hobbit ends up a supporting character in his own movies. Why you gotta do Bilbo dirty like that?
It's Bilbo Baggins.
Continuing with fantasy literary adaptations, a case could be made that the Harry Potter movies are actually a little too faithful to the novels, especially the earlier entries. They're often so busy trying to cram in everything we remember from the books that they forget to have any fun with it. But one strange change the movies did make was to add romantic tension between Harry and Hermione that wasn't there in the books. It's not a terrible decision exactly. Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson have great chemistry, but it doesn't really go anywhere, and when Ron's jealousy boils over in Deathly Hallows Part 1, it all feels kinda awkward and tacked on. And then there's the fact that they changed Harry's eyes from green to blue. We get that Daniel Radcliffe was allergic to the green contact lenses, but for some people, it may have ruined their childhood. Paul W.S. Anderson's Resident Evil movies certainly have their defenders, and in those very same eyes, their charms. But not everybody was pleased that the series revolved around a main character who didn't appear in any of the games. Alice, played by Mila Jovovich, certainly interacted with many familiar faces from the games, including Chris Redfield, Leon Kennedy, and Jill Valentine. But her character was invented entirely for the movies, and she was the main focus of every entry. Good change? Bad change? Well, we're kinda on the fence, because we love Jovovich, and Alice was a fun character, but ultimately, if you hated the change, there's a new movie coming out with Claire Redfield and Jill Valentine as the main characters. If you've seen the Twilight movies, you may remember the big battle between the Cullens, the werewolves, and the Volturi at the end of Breaking Dawn Part 2. If you've read the Twilight books, you may remember that there is in fact no big battle at the end. So what gives? Well, we'd argue that this change was a pretty positive one. It gives the movie something major to build up to, and it makes for a pretty rousing climax. It's probably the best set piece in the series, and it's fun to see everybody let loose with their powers, charging at each other and jumping around like it's a big finale in a Marvel movie. Of course, it ends up being a premonition, which is a bit of a cop-out, but yeah, I guess you can't have everything. Sticking with YA adaptations, the Hunger Games movies are mostly pretty faithful to the books that they're based on.
It was Peeta that you wanted rescued from the arena.
But there's one change that a lot of fans were unhappy about, and we can't say that we blame them. In the books, after sustaining an injury to his leg during the games, Peeta suffers from blood poisoning. It's so serious that he ends up having his leg amputated and replaced with a prosthetic. It's a shame for a few reasons. For starters, it removes some disability representation that would have been really nice to have on the big screen. But it also robs us of the book's very sensitive portrayal of Peeta. His injury is mentioned several times in the rest of the books, but it doesn't define his character, and it doesn't turn him bitter and vengeful. While it doesn't ruin the movie by any means, it just kinda would have been cool to have in there, you know?
No, not really.
We're back at Marvel again, and another entry that took some pretty major liberties with the source material. Fans were divided on this one, and while we could see why, we think the changes make a lot of sense. Civil War was a seminal comic event, to be sure, but it also had the advantage of taking place on the page where the writers had access to every Marvel character they wanted. You want to do big splash pages with every Marvel hero facing off? Yeah, sure, go nuts. That wasn't a possibility in the movies, at least not in 2016. See, there were relatively few costumed heroes to choose from, and the film had to introduce both Black Panther and Spider-Man just to bulk up the numbers. More to the point, it made sense for the movie to root its central conflict in the existing dynamics between the characters. The way Iron Man and Captain America act makes sense. They're flawed guys, and both of them make points worth listening to.
Give me a break!
We didn't need a sudden heel turn from Tony Stark, an element from the comic book story that arguably hasn't aged well. Plus, the movie gave us that sweet airport fight. I mean, what more do you want? We've only gotten the first trailer for the upcoming Uncharted movie, and the reactions to that were, let's just say, mixed. While we can't judge the final product yet, it does look as though the filmmakers have made at least one major change while adapting Naughty Dog's much-loved series. The first meeting between Nathan Drake and Sully.
My friends call me Sully.
In the game, Nate is 15 when he meets Sully, and they're both on the trail of the same treasure. They butt heads a little, but it's the beginning of a beautiful friendship. In the movie, Nate is a bit older and seems to be working in a bar when he meets Sully. Why the change? Well, it remains to be seen, but it effectively erases Uncharted 3 from continuity, and fans might have something to say about that. On the surface, Zack Snyder's Watchmen adaptation might seem pretty faithful to the legendary graphic novel. Visually, it certainly looks like Watchmen, reproducing iconic panels and giving us a pretty perfect rendering of Dr. Manhattan. But under the surface, it's a very different beast. Controversially, it made big changes to the original comic's ending, removing the fake alien squid entirely. Would the squid have been too out there for general audiences? Potentially, but hey, if they can accept a glowing blue naked god who experiences all of time at once, they probably could have handled the squid. On top of that, a lot of the comic's dark irony and satire is gone.
I think you were trying to make a point.
For example, making Night Owl and Silk Spectre into badass slow-mo martial arts experts who can pretty much defy gravity. While understandable to make the film a little bit more punchy, pun somewhat intended, they're supposed to be normal people, Zach. That was the whole point. And don't even get us started on the Hallelujah sex scene. And finally, we haven't seen the Super Mario movie yet, and it could be great. We certainly hope it is. I certainly hope it is. But you've got to admit this new movie is off to a pretty controversial start by replacing longtime Mario voice actor Charles Martinet with Hollywood's own Chris Pratt. Yeah, the internet had a lot to say about that. And yes, Pratt is a funny guy, but for gamers like yours truly, Charles Martinet is Mario.
I've been the voice of Mario for 26 years.
And Luigi. And Wario.
You gonna eat that garlic?
Donkey Kong. And if you're also just figuring out how easy it would have been for them to save a whole bunch of money on the budget by just having him do all the voices himself, yeah. And that'll wrap it up for this list. But before we let you all go, we feel that one of the most bizarre movie changes is in James Cameron's Titanic, which introduces two main characters, Jack and Rose, who weren't in the original story. Wait a second, checks notes, based on real events. So does that make it better or worse? Let us know down below, will ya?